Hey everybody, welcome back to the Seagull Football Network. I'm Braden, my brother Ben is on, and today we are going to be jumping into our NFC West deep dive. So we're going to kick it off today with the San Francisco 49ers and dive into kind of a look into their season coming up. So we are going to start off with their biggest strength, and Ben, I want to go to you. What is the 49ers' greatest strength going into the 2024 season?
Yeah, I think one of the, default answers would be the offense, but I'm actually going to be going the opposite direction here. In my opinion, the biggest strength is the 49ers defense. We saw a defensive coordinator change this year, going from um, Steve Wilkes to I forgot his name, Daniel Sorensen. And that's going to be a really interesting change going forward. I think that one of the things that I noticed in a lot of the press conferences and things with Sorensen and with the players is the kind of these guys seem like they're ready to fight for him, and that's something that we didn't really see in the interviews with Steve Wilkes. And so I think just the personality of this team is going to change under this defense. On top of that, I think continuity in the linebacker core and the secondary is going to be incredible for this team. They had very little turnover in that area of the team, and that was one of their strongest areas last year. Obviously, Dre Greenlaw is coming back from an injury, and that could give them issues. But I don't think it's going to be the biggest issue in the world, especially considering they drafted Tatum Bethune, who I think could actually start in this defense and be okay. Their rotational defensive linemen are going to help generate pressure and avoid fatigue, which is something that they did seem to deal with last year with the trade from Malik Collins. Obviously, they signed Leonard Floyd. Um, they brought in Yetur Gross Matos and Jordan Elliott, who are incredible rotational defensive tackles. I think that this defensive line is going to be formidable and very strong all season long. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. Unlike you, I was unable to decide which side of the ball I thought was going to be their greatest strength because really they're just so complete. And so for their biggest strength, I ended up picking their personnel as a whole. I think they have the most complete roster in the NFL right now, top to bottom, just great starters on both sides of the ball, great players. But yeah, I think their defense is going to be phenomenal. I think it's unfortunate that Steve Wilkes kind of got cut as like the scapegoat after the Super Bowl loss. It They were played phenomenal defense every part of the season and just couldn't hold up against Mahomes, who is the greatest quarterback in the league right now. Unfortunate that he ended up suffering the consequences for that, but I think their defense is going to be incredible. I love the offense that they've put together. Um, and so yeah, I just think they have the most complete roster in the NFL.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. I think this is a conversation very similar to our conversation with the Kansas City Chiefs last week. Just kind of the whole, like, obviously they've got different parts of the team that are less strong and all of this, but as a whole, that we're hitting on the Niners and the Chiefs really early, and these two are teams that are you can't ever count them out for the Super Bowl. And the Niners are a very strong team, depth wise, starters wise, across the board, and it's going to be really exciting to watch them all season.
Yeah, absolutely. And that does bring us to their biggest weakness, which I have listed as the offensive line. I was looking through some other rankings. PFF had them ranked at 24th in the NFL last season, which is the only position group that ranked the Niners lower than 12th in the league, which is a pretty big deal. I think that just points to how complete their roster is and the fact that the O line is just the weakest. They weren't the greatest at protecting Brock Purdy last year, um, which I think is going to be a big thing moving forward. If you can just give him a little bit of extra time, I think he's going to be even better than what we've seen so far.
Yeah, I agree completely. That was my biggest weakness as well. I specified interior offensive line, but as a whole, this offensive line hasn't been invested in the way that it should be for a team of this caliber. I think that Trent Williams is great. Colton McKivitz on the right tackle side is good. On the interior, I mean, Aaron Banks has been good at times. Jake Brendel, Spencer Burford have both been not good at all, frankly. I think some people would argue, oh, they've been serviceable. Well, when you have a Super Bowl caliber roster, two of 22 starters is not going to cause you all the problems in the world. but I agree completely. The Super Bowl said it all. We saw Chris Jones and that pass rush up the middle wrecking Brock Purdy play after play after play. And I would argue that that is what lost them the Super Bowl was Brock Purdy didn't have time to throw. He had guys in his face all the time, and he was getting trashed every single down. And if their interior offensive line would be better, this team could and should win a Super Bowl. And considering logistically their window is closing quick, I'm it's not a good weakness to have.
All right. So who do you have listed as your X factor for the 49ers?
Yeah, so my X factor is actually Brandon Ayuk, which I think does need some explaining to it. So Brandon Ayuk, obviously, as we know, hasn't reached a long-term contract with the 49ers yet. I think that Brandon Ayuk, if he is on the roster, that offense will hum. They will work together. They'll be the Super Bowl level offense that they were last year. The problem is that if he's not on the roster, if he does get traded, if he does hold out from the team, that offense will struggle. Really, that leaves them in terms of pass catchers Debo Samuel, George Kittle, Christian McCaffrey. Those are their three main ones. After that, they drafted Ricky Pearsall in the first round, right out of Florida. And I think Ricky Pearsall can and will be a starter in the NFL. I just don't see him as a starter now or anytime this year. I think he needs a lot of work on his route running, his ability to break open against press. I think his deep cover or his deep route running is good, but I think he really just needs to work on those little things, especially in a Shanahan offense where it's all about rhythm and perfection in those routes. Everything timing wise is perfect. And so with Ricky Pearsall, probably not being an immediate option, I think if Brandon Ayuk isn't there in San Francisco, it could become a real issue for them very quickly. So here's to hoping that Brandon Ayuk gets his contract situation figured out, because otherwise the Niners may be a very different offense, and it could be interesting to watch.
Yeah, and I just saw the other day that he was meeting with the big brass there at the 49ers organization, trying to get this difference resolved. And so it sounds like they're trying to get something working. Now, in all fairness to the 49ers, Kittle, Debo Samuel, and Christian McCaffrey is a pretty solid trio as it stands. But I agree that Ayuk is just that extra bit that gets him over the top. He had an excellent year last season. Um, yeah, I think he's a really dynamic player, and I'm hoping they get him back so that they can continue to be successful. I did go a slightly different route. I actually went with McCaffrey as my X factor. I think it was pretty clear when they traded for him just what a difference he made for that team and for that offense especially. He added a whole new dimension. And the Niners and Shanahan have been known for having really solid running backs, but he's just completely different from everybody else that they've had there. He looks different. He feels different. His stats are different. He's just a different player than everybody else, and I think he really adds another layer onto the offense that just gets them up to that next level. And unfortunately, he was held in check a certain amount during the Super Bowl. Just another reason why the Chiefs pulled out ahead. But that's who I picked for my X factor for the 49ers. Yeah, I do think it's worth mentioning. I was struggling to pick between McCaffrey and Fred Warner. I think it's also worth mentioning that Fred Warner could also be that guy. I was looking through his stats. He's never missed a game in all of his seasons playing. He's played all 16 and 17 games. And last season, he had a career high 4 forced fumbles and 4 interceptions. So, I mean, he's just continuing to improve every year. And I'm really excited to see what he can do this year, especially looking at a new defensive scheme. Hopefully, it's something that he fits well into and he can continue to perform.
Yeah, well, I think something to note is under Sorensen, this defense is remaining the same. They've been running the same defense since D'Amico Ryans was in San Francisco, scheme wise, and so that's why Fred Warner is such a good fit there. That's why he signed his new contract, I think in 2020. And so for him, it's not as much going to be a schematic change as much as just certain situational play call changes, which I don't think Fred Warner will have an issue with. So I agree. If we were going offensive versus defensive X factor, Fred Warner will be the defensive one for sure.
Yeah. Um, for my rookie, we already you touched on him a little bit. I picked wide receiver Ricky Pearsall. I think he has the right tools in the tool belt to be able to come in and replace a little bit of what Brandon Ayuk was if they don't manage to get him back. I think his size and his route running are really, really good. I think he looks solid there. And if he gets starting time, I think he could have a chance to really contribute. But I think the most important thing is that he complements Debo Samuel really well. I think he seems like he's a little bit of a bigger build. Um, I saw a lot of people saying he's good at going up for the ball, coming down with it, whereas Debo's more of that gadget and speed player. I think if they can use Ricky Pearsall's size to their advantage, they can have something really solid there. Who did you pick for your rookie?
Yeah, I get what you're saying. Everything I watched from Pearsall pre-draft, I mean, it was the same stuff. I was wowed by his size. He had decent speed for how large he was. But I struggled just a little bit. Like he seemed to have natural shiftiness, but he seemed like he didn't use it in the right places sometimes, and it made his route running a little bit funky. And I agree completely. He's got that 50-50 ball size, that strength at the top of the catch. But I at the same time on, those routine catches, those, simple digs, outs, comebacks, things like that, he seemed to struggle with some focus drops. And so I just have some concerns about Pearsall potentially not being the guy going into the season if Ayuk's not there. I think he can be and will be eventually, but it just might take some time. Yeah, so my rookie was third rounder, I believe 81st overall. No, 86th overall. Dominic Pooney, that is inside offensive lineman. Well, I say inside because I think that that's where he's going to project in the NFL, but he actually played guard and tackle for Kansas. He was a great run blocker. He was a pretty good pass blocker. I think he had some issues with footwork, especially at tackle, but I think that those things can be overcome. I actually projected kind of the entire roster and kind of where I thought everybody was going to lay out this season. And one of the notes that I made is that Pooney could be a starter at either guard position instead of Jake Brendel or Spencer Burford this year. I don't know kind of how that'll turn out or whether he will, but I think he could be a week one starter on that roster. And I think that that makes him very notable in this draft class of a lot of kind of future thinking picks. If you are familiar with this draft class, it was a lot of, hey, we know we have aged players at this position. We know our Super Bowl window isn't huge right now. Let's think toward the future and let's bring in players who can contribute 2 years down the line. Dominic Pooney, on the other hand, I think really is going to be a good starting offensive lineman for them, potentially this year, but definitely within the next 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, for sure. So that brings us to the last segment here, which is the biggest games. I have three listed. The first one I have is Week 7 against the Chiefs. We talked about this previously when we were doing the AFC West. I mean, it's a Super Bowl matchup, different rosters by a little bit. I mean, it's going to be a really good game to see if the 49ers can pull it off or if the Chiefs are going to stay dominant in this matchup.
Yeah, I agree. Obviously, we talked about this with the Chiefs matchup. It's one of those. It's the two wrecking balls of the NFL. And them meeting in the playoffs, even the Super Bowl, like that's one thing. But in the regular season is going to be really interesting to kind of see how those teams react. I think it's what week 7, so it will be really cool to kind of.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. The second game I had was Week 8 against the Cowboys, with them being another big conference rival who has been in the playoffs for the last few years as well. It's a big one that may have playoff implications. And then the last game I picked similar reason was for similar reasons, and that's Week 17 against the Lions. So, what games do you have? Is there any more overlap between those last two?
Yeah, so I had the Lions. I agree with you completely. Being an NFC game, being late in the season, that's going to really determine kind of how that playoff picture shapes out. I think that the Lions and the Niners both have a real chance at that number one seed. So being a Week 17 game, that's going to be all eyes on that game for sure. I think a kind of under the radar game that I did take note of is Week 12 at the Green Bay Packers. I think not a lot of people realize that if the ball had bounced a different way 2, maybe 3 times last year, the Green Bay Packers could have been in the NFC Championship. They were a 9-8 team, but they didn't play like one in the playoffs. And I think this year, given a couple tweaks, and an easier schedule overall, I think that the Packers could be a real threat in the NFC. As much as it pains me to say that, and so I think a Week 12 game against the Niners will really be kind of a shape up test for them for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. That wraps up the 49ers. The next team we have up on the list is the Los Angeles Rams. So we're going to kick it off with the biggest strength. What do you have listed for the Rams?
Yeah, I actually went back and forth on this because genuinely the Rams are one of my favorite teams in terms of just how well rounded they are. I think since their 2021 Super Bowl, they've kind of flown under the radar as a whole. Teams haven't really seen them as a threat. A lot of fans kind of just have forgotten that they are a good, solid team. But I think this year is going to be when that changes. And so I was kind of bouncing between a couple of players and a couple of positions and stuff. And I eventually came back to one that I was like, this is the obvious answer. And for me, that's Matthew Stafford. Matthew Stafford has been a great, probably top 5 to 7, maybe top 10 QB his entire career. And that was as a Detroit Lion, right? So I think as long as Matthew Stafford is healthy, the Rams will be a competitive team on offense. The more weapons he has around him, the better. Obviously, in 2022, we saw what happened when that offensive line was a hot mess. I mean, he obviously didn't even finish the season. I think Baker Mayfield ended up finishing out that season. But I think that if Stafford remains healthy, which behind this offensive line he will, then this team will be good, and Matthew Stafford will be their biggest strength.
Yeah, absolutely. He is part of the biggest strength that I picked. I kind of specified the whole offense. I love how young parts of it are. They're very high power with Puka Nakua, Kyron Williams. They've got other young guys they just drafted. They've got a lot of really young, high power, talented individuals. And then you've got Cooper Kupp and Matthew Stafford bringing in the veteran experience, kind of guiding this young offense along. I just don't think it gets a whole lot better than that when you have physically talented guys led by also physically talented guys, but they really bring that experience. They've been to Super Bowls, they've won a lot of games, and so I think that's really going to be a helpful aspect for the Rams moving forward this season. Yeah, so that brings us up to the biggest weakness. This one was a little tough. I kind of bounced around a little bit. I finally settled down on their secondary. Looking at their stats from last year, they allowed the 12th most passing yards per game. And I just don't know that they've really done enough in the offseason to fix it. They added a couple of people. Tre'Davious White is really the big name that I saw, but I just don't know that it's going to be enough to completely turn their secondary around. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I actually that's also what I put was their secondary. I think that that defense is even with the loss of Aaron Donald a very good defense, but that secondary is just I mean it's a bit of a mess. Obviously they lost Jordan Fuller at safety, which is a large hit in itself. But I also think that they failed to really adequately replace him. They brought in Cameron Curl from Washington as the replacement there at safety. I think Cameron Curl is a good player. I just don't see him as necessarily a game changer in the back of that defense. I think that, safety Russ Yeast is a middling player. I think he's a good safety, not great, especially with the loss of Jordan Fuller. I think his ability to play in the box is going to probably decrease a lot. Um, they swapped Akello Witherspoon for Darius Williams, who's actually coming back to Los Angeles after being, I think, in Jacksonville for a couple of years. I think that in doing so, they kind of swapped a cheaper contract for a couple more boom plays per week. And outside of Darius Williams himself, that corner room is kind of bare with I think Darian Kendrick and Kobe Durant. So it'll be an interesting group. I don't think it's a bad group. It's very young. But I agree completely that secondary is just going to struggle a little bit against prolific passers.
Yeah, so what did you pick for your X factor? Who do you have down?
Yeah, so for my X factor, I put Puka Nakua. The reason that I put Puka Nakua here is obviously nobody really, except shout out Brett Coleman on Bootleg Football. Outside of Brett Coleman coming into the draft, nobody really expected Puka Nakua to be anybody really special. He was, late round guy. People had issues with his size, his catch radius. I saw some things like his athletic profile wasn't great, which I agree with. Like you look at him and he just doesn't scream number one wide receiver, right? And so when he popped off last year, it kind of was a surprise to everybody. I'm not saying he won't pop off again this year, but I think he as a player and Los Angeles as an offense needs to kind of adjust how they use him and when and in what context to truly keep him consistent and still at the top of his game. I think teams are going to be planning against him. And I think he needs to find that one or two spots in this offense where he can truly dominate. How Cooper Cup, Michael Thomas at a time, Justin Jefferson did to stay good receivers, right? If he can maintain the workload that Los Angeles expects from him and stay healthy throughout all of that, I think the Rams offense will have no issue. But that's why I label him my X factor. Is I think that he's the make or break for that offense, and if he can't find consistency, the Rams offense will struggle.
Yeah, and I mean we saw what happened last season. I think it was week 18 against the Niners, where he was a couple yards away from getting the rookie receiving record, and they double covered him on almost every single play, desperate to stop him from getting that record. I mean, he is able to be limited when you put a bunch of attention towards him, but I think the question really is, are teams going to be able to do that and still defend the rest of the field from the other players they have? So it's a difficult task to erase him, but if a team can manage to do it, it's going to be really tough for the Rams. I pivoted kind of a different direction. I did go with Matthew Stafford for my X factor. I think the biggest thing for him this season is just going to be availability. He just has to stay upright, stay healthy, and keep delivering the ball. And as long as he does that, I think he'll be okay. I know there's some questions about his age, um, and it's like Burrow was talking about recently. There's like that football mortality that you start to process, and if he starts to get too focused on, oh, I got to get another ring before I retire, I'm worried that he might not perform as well if he's trying too hard. So I think his availability and his focus are going to be the biggest things for him and for the Rams this season.
Yeah, I can agree with that. I will note for the Rams, it hurts when your starting quarterback goes down. Obviously, we've learned that way more past couple of years with the 17 games, 18-week season. It hurts more and more and more for these players, and it's harder to keep the same 11 guys on the field week by week. And so obviously if Stafford goes down, that's going to hurt regardless. But I will note, I think they did a really good job thinking about the future by signing Jimmy Garoppolo. So if Stafford does go down, they do have an insurance policy.
All right, for notable rookie, I cheated a little bit. I picked two, but I think it makes a lot of sense. I Yeah, so I picked the combo of Braden Fisk and Jared Verse, two guys who already played together in college. Unbelievable that the Rams managed to draft both of them this season, and they're joining a defense that has obviously they have an Aaron Donald shaped hole in the middle of that offense or that defense, and I think they're going to combine to try to start filling that up. Uh, Obviously, like dominant defensive players, young athletic guys, already great chemistry together, and I think it's quite possible that they manage to help support that secondary that we just talked about isn't necessarily the best in football. And so I think from day one they're going to be able to have a pretty dominant effect on the field. What are your thoughts?
No, I agree completely. I liked how you put it as the Aaron Donald shaped hole. Obviously, that's going to be, it's not just like a one size fits all or, oh, this player profiles as this player. Like Aaron Donald is the type of player you can't just replace. Sometimes you can replace with certain body builds and certain speeds and stuff, but that's not something you can do. So I think that this year, and I think their roster changes kind of represent that, they're going to aim for a little bit of a different approach in terms of how they're going to run that defensive line and that pass rush. I think they're going for a more rotational approach. Obviously, Jared Verse and Braden Fisk are going to feature heavily in that. They have defensive tackle Kobe Turner, Michael Hoyt. They did draft defensive end Brennan Jackson in, I think, the fifth round. Yeah, the fifth round. I had like a third round grade on him. I really liked Brennan Jackson. I think he's really fast, very good with his hands. Super lucky that they were able to get their hands on him. And obviously, Byron Young out of maybe South Carolina. I don't remember. Byron Young had an incredible rookie season last year from the outside linebacker position, and I think he's going to continue to do so on this defensive line. So I agree completely. The Verse Fisk combination is just one of many steps to try to replace the legacy that Aaron Donald left. For my notable rookie, I went a little bit of a different direction. I figured that the Fisk and Verse was going to be your pick, or we'd talk about it prior. So my pick was Michigan running back Blake Corum, who I think they took in the third round. Um, I think a lot of people kind of shrugged that pick off. I know I talked to some people who were like, "Oh, Blake Corum went to a team with Kyron Williams. Like, what a waste of talent." Interesting take, and I can see where that argument is made. But I actually would argue Blake Corum can and probably will be the starter by the end of the year. If you want my easy answer, it's going to be, hey, there's 17 weeks. Like there's a lot of football to be played, and the Rams run a whole heck of a lot. So if it's just an injury to Kyron Williams, I wouldn't be surprised. However, I think that it's more than that. Blake Corum was not just some good player at Michigan. He was an incredible player. He was great after the catch, between the tackles. He's barreled downhill. One of the best running backs in this draft class at pass protection. And pass pro is one of those things that is has to be taught to every running back coming into the league because it's not an easy thing. It's not something that colleges teach their running backs as much as they could or should. Um, I know one of the biggest concerns for him coming into the league was that he's only, I think, 5'8" or 5'9", but he hasn't had much of an issue with injury. And I think that with his decisive cuts, his physical play, he is a perfect fit for Los Angeles, with their running backs, Cam Akers, with, Kyron Williams, and now Blake Corum. I think they have a very specific type of running back. It's a small guy, hard hitter, puts his shoulder down for every hit, makes decisive cuts. I think Corum fits that perfectly, and I could see him being a much bigger part of this offense than people expect.
Yeah, that's fair. I'm a big fan of Kyron Williams. I loved what I saw from him last year. I'm not totally convinced yet that he will be replaced. I think it's a possibility, but I think he's definitely going to get the starting job day one, and I think they're going to try to use them more as complementary backs with different roles in the offense, if I had to guess. Um, but it's certainly possible. I think it's also worth pointing out Cam Akers is a free agent. He is no longer on the Rams, so it really puts Williams and Corum as the top two.
Yeah, no, and I completely agree with what you're saying. I'm not sitting here saying, Kyron Williams isn't a good running back or anything. I just think that Blake Corum profiles perfectly into that Shanahan tree type of running back. Think Elijah Mitchell. Think Christian McCaffrey, Kyron Williams, Cam Akers, Daryl Henderson. It's very similar type of running back. Oh, and San Francisco actually just drafted Isaac Guerendo. I forget where he went to school, but it's a very similar type of running back, and I think Corum profiles into that well. So I agree with what you're saying. I wouldn't be surprised if it's a 50-50 snap share there. Just an interesting thing to watch for sure.
Yeah, so that brings us up to the biggest games. What do you have as the biggest games for the Rams this season?
Yeah, so for the biggest games for the Rams, a really interesting one that I listed, it's actually technically two, is the two Seattle games. And obviously that's a divisional, so haha, whatever. But I actually think that those will be very interesting games because there's a reason that the Seattle Seahawks brought in Mike Macdonald, and obviously we'll probably get into that in a couple of minutes as well. But Mike Macdonald is one of the best defensive minds in the sport. And what better way to counter, Sean McVay and Kyle Shanahan than to bring in the best defensive mind in the sport? And so I think that the Seattle games will be a very interesting game to watch. I think Seattle's already made some really nice changes to that secondary. So seeing how they counter Puka Nakua, Cooper Cup, Tyler Higbee, Matthew Stafford throwing to them, and then obviously Corum and Williams between the tackles will be a really interesting game to watch. And I expect Seattle to really put up a fight in those games.
Yeah, absolutely. I think those will be very interesting. I went a similar route. I have weeks 3 and 15 against the 49ers. I think it's a similar to what you were just saying with the Seahawks. It's a good offensive minded matchup. It's a great defense against a great offense against a great defense. I think overall we just have the opportunity for either really high or really low scoring games there. And then I also picked out week 1 at the Lions. Obviously the Jared Goff Matthew Stafford rematch in Detroit. And then I also have week 12 against the Eagles. It's kind of middle of the season towards the end. Uh, there's a good chance that it has playoff implications. I don't exactly know what to expect from the Eagles yet. There's been some change ups and such there. But it could potentially have some playoff implications, and so that's one that I want to keep an eye on as well. Right. Yeah, so we were just talking about this team a little bit, but that brings us up to the Seattle Seahawks. For their biggest strength, this is something you kind of just mentioned a little bit. I put down their cornerbacks. I'm a really big fan of the young, athletic, speedy corner group that they've put together. Tariq Woolen and Devin Witherspoon might just be the best cornerback duo in the NFL right now. What do you think about those two?
That is a really, really bold claim, but I can't even say that I disagree. I put down secondary, so kind of, same line of thinking that you had. I think Tariq Woolen and Devin Witherspoon were already playing. Oh, and Michael Jackson, Kobe Bryant. All of those guys rotating in at the slot, some outside. Um, I think that all four of those guys were very good corners under Pete Carroll. And obviously, no shot at Pete Carroll, incredible coach, great defensive mind. But I think Mike McDonald, what he does with his secondary, I watched a lot of Baltimore, leading up to this episode just because I kind of wanted to see what he did with his secondary. And obviously, it kind of helped add to what I already knew about it. But the man doesn't have like a cornerback and a safety, and he doesn't run, outside corner, slot, and like two safeties. No, no, no. It's these guys are defensive backs, and they can go anywhere on the field, and they're going to be good at what they do. It's terrifying because all of these guys are flexible, and I think that Devin Witherspoon, Tariq Woolen, obviously, they brought in Rayshon Jenkins, I think was in Jacksonville last year, and then Julian Love. This is a really, really strong secondary, and these guys are going to be all over the field. I expect, and maybe this is a bold claim, editor, write it down or something. I expect this team to lead the NFL in takeaways.
Wow. Yeah, that's one we'll have to double check at the end of the season. We'll see if that's a good prediction or not. I was going to mention as well, any team that has Michael Jackson and Kobe Bryant on your team, I mean, you're just winning, right? Yeah. All right. Well, that takes us on to the biggest weakness next. What do you have listed for the Seahawks?
Yeah, prep yourselves, Seahawks fans. This is something you guys were familiar with back in the Russell Wilson days, and I think it's coming back to haunt you again. I think the biggest weakness for the Seattle Seahawks is the offensive line. Um, I hate to say it because I'm a big fan of Charles Cross, Abraham Lucas, on the left and right side. Unfortunately, both of them have struggled with injuries, inconsistent play throughout their short careers. Then on the inside, you've got Laken Tomlinson, Nick Harris, and I really think that Christian Haynes, they drafted in the third round, 81st overall, is going to start on that roster. Um, and so the interior is either a couple of bridge players or a rookie. And so I think that this line, it's not going to be the worst in the world, but it's also going to give the offense some fits, especially considering what Ryan Grubb is trying to do with that offense. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I also have the O line listed. Looking into it, they've had a lot of rotation over the last couple of years, and just since Gino started playing there, he's had 32 games over the last 2 seasons, and he's taken 77 sacks, which is the third most in that time frame. Yeah, he only gets beaten out by Justin Fields and Russell Wilson uh, for most sacks taken. Right. And so yeah, I've seen like they've made some additions, they're doing some shuffling, but I think it's going to be difficult for them to get the O line to coordinate well enough to really protect Gino the way that they should be. And obviously, 2 years ago, we saw what Gino could do even without much of an O line. He still got sacked a bunch of times. I think it was 41 or 43 2 seasons ago. Um, but it's still just going to be a really, really difficult spot for them to be able to run an offense if he's getting sacked all the time. So yeah, I also listed the O line. Yes, that brings us up to the X factor. I actually did list Geno Smith. I know I've gone quarterback a couple times now, but I think he's really the key to their success if they're going to have any. If he can settle in and repeat even a little bit of what he did 2 years ago, I think they've a competitive season. They can be contenders. But if he has a season more similar to last year, I think they end up middle of the pack towards the bottom of their division, not really looking at much in the later half of the season. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. It is an interesting thing to note that they were 9-8 both last year and the year before. Um, but those were two very different 9-8 teams. The 2022 9-8 team, Geno Smith was electric, obviously, and I'm not just saying, oh, he's a bridge quarterback who did a little better than we expected. No, he was genuinely good at football, which I think is the first time that we've seen Geno Smith be good at football since he was in college. And so, it was a very electric team. It was that defense was all over the place. Obviously, Geno Smith carried that offense. He was a huge part of it. 2023, we saw Geno kind of come back to the ground a little bit. I'm not saying he was Geno Smith from the rest of his career because he was a lot better than that, but we still saw, obviously a sophomore slump of sorts. Um, but and so I completely agree, that's a really good X factor, to kinda talk about because he could be elite, well, not necessarily elite, but he could be very good and make that offense very good, or he could struggle in Ryan Grubb's new Washington-esque offense, and maybe they're a different type of 9-8 team. Yeah. So for my X factor, I kind of talked about this a little bit when I talked about their weakness. I said the offensive tackles. Um, I like I said, I'm not a fan of Laken Tomlinson or Nick Harris at left guard and center for them. I think that they're fine players. Nick Harris was in Cleveland for a while. Worked with Bill Callahan, right? Decent offensive line coach. Laken Tomlinson is on the older side. I want to say he's I think 31 or 32 now. So I that part of the line is not the greatest in my opinion. Rookie Christian Haynes obviously is starting, but those tackles both have the potential to be very, very good. I Abraham Lucas obviously was I think the fifth or sixth round, but Charles Cross was an early first rounder. Both of them, when they're on the field, are really, really good players. They, high rated players, don't commit a lot of penalties, but they have not been able to stay steady, consistent, or stay healthy really at all throughout their short careers insofar. So I'll be very interested to see kind of if they can um, remain healthy, because if they can, this offense will look a lot better for it.
Yeah, absolutely. That kind of leads right into who I picked for rookie. You've already mentioned him twice now. I ended up picking Christian Haynes, the guard. I think this kind of helps fill a little bit of a hole that they're missing a player. Damian Lewis went off to the Panthers. He was PFF's highest rated player on their offensive line. He's gone, so I think if they can kind of fit Christian Haynes in there, they can at least keep one of those positions on the line stable and try to protect Gino as much as possible and give him a good chance of success. Who do you have down for your notable rookie?
Yeah, I mean Christian Haynes was my honorable mention. He was my second place there. Big fan of him. I of all of those, third, fourth round linemen, he was probably one of my favorites because I was like, I genuinely can see him starting day one. Luckily, he went to a team that needs a starter day one. So I agree completely. He's not necessarily going to be, like you said, Damian Lewis player right off the bat, but he's going to be a good guard for them. And I think, especially with the way that they're implementing a new offense, it's not like he's behind anybody. He's learning right with them, so it'll be good for him. My notable rookie is their first rounder, kind of a gimme pick, I guess, Byron Murphy the second. I think he definitely shouldn't have fallen to 16th. But it was a very offense heavy offense early draft. So a lot of defensive players fell to that 12 to 20 something range that they were way more valuable than. So I think Seattle got a real steal here. Um, if you kind of, look at Mike McDonald again, going back to how he runs defenses, he's got two different types of defensive tackles in the middle of that defense. He's got the Justin Madubuike, who is more of a pass rushy. Think Aaron Donald. He's really fast. He's got good hands, and he's the one who's going to come in and he's going to get sacks up the middle. He's going to take that running back out. Then you have Michael Pierce, and Michael Pierce is just a big man. His entire job is just to hold as many offensive linemen as he possibly can and push backwards. And I think that Mike McDonald's keeping his options open. He's got Leonard Williams up the middle already, who I think could fit either of those. But now bringing in Byron Murphy, he's just found his Justin Madubuike. He's found his pass rushing, quick hands kind of player, and I think Byron Murphy's going to be a really good player in that position. And at 16, that's really really good value for the Texas alum.
Yeah, I believe in our mock draft, I think that's who I had the Seahawks taking at that position. I think he's a really good fit for what they're trying to do and kind of gives them. I mean, obviously they've got a great secondary. Good to have some pressure up front as well to ease some of the pressure on them, make their jobs a little bit easier. So I think he's going to be a really solid player for them as well. That brings us up to the biggest games. Why don't you go ahead first? I have kind of a wild card one we'll save for the end here.
Yeah, so my first ones actually are it's two games kind of combined, and there's a reason for this. So I think that a lot of people are going to write off Seattle as a rebuilding team, but I don't actually think that very much. I think Seattle has the potential to be a winning team right off the bat. They're not necessarily going to be, 13, 14 wins, Super Bowl contending team, but I think even with the coaching change, they could be a 9 or 10 win team. But I think two games that are going to really govern that are both divisionals, and it's week 9 and week 11 surrounding their bye week. Because that's just going to show how this team with the new coaching, new, health and safety staff, all of this is going to kind of deal with that bye week. They've got a home game against Los Angeles in week 9, then they've got the bye, and then they travel to San Francisco. And it's going to be really interesting to see, what their record is leading up to those weeks and how they deal with the bye and then how they come out of the bye in arguably one of the toughest stadiums to play in against definitely the toughest team to play against in the NFL.
Yeah, absolutely. I also included the 49ers. I have both of their games there. The 49ers have just been dominant in their division, out of their division, across the board. And so I think how the Seattle Seahawks react to playing against this dominant team who's just in the Super Bowl is going to tell us a lot about their season. I also included week 4 at the Lions. At this point, any NFC team who might be a contender who plays the Lions, it's a big game. It's going to have huge playoff implications down the line. And then the last one I picked, which is kind of the wild card one, is week 17 at Chicago. If the Seattle Seahawks are in contention, this might be a really big game. It is December 26th, the day after Christmas, in Chicago, the Windy City. And if they, it could be maybe they knock the Bears out of the playoffs with a win. Maybe it's they get into the playoffs with a win. And I think this could be there's the potential for this to have a really big impact on the playoff seeding when we get that far into the season. So this is one that kind of a tentative stick a tab on it. It might be a big deal by the time we get there.
I agree completely. I definitely didn't have that on my list, but as you were talking about it, it does kind of seem like a litmus test for both of these teams. Obviously, Chicago has the continuity of the same coaching staff, a lot of the same team, but they did bring in Caleb Williams, Keenan Allen, a brand new offense against Mike McDonald, his new coaching staff, and that new defense. It'll be really interesting to see, kind of, because this could be the future of the NFC. If San Francisco, Detroit eventually start letting go of that chokehold they've got, it could be interesting to see if Chicago or Seattle becomes kind of the new champion of the NFC.
Yeah, and I think we need to go back and mention really fast. I can't believe we haven't at all. The Seattle Seahawks receivers are also a solid group. Um, I almost had them as the biggest strength between DK, Tyler Lockett, and JSN. I mean, they're just a solid crew all around. They can pretty much do it all. So I don't quite want to move on without mentioning the receivers there. Yeah, absolutely.
Look, I'm a big fan of Chicago and Seattle's rosters. Genuinely, I obviously everybody's looking at San Francisco and Detroit, maybe even Green Bay, but I do like those teams that are kind of that second tier who have that opportunity to grow and in maybe 2 years could be that new era of teams to be good. And I think that Chicago and Seattle both have a real chance at being that. So I that is a good game to watch.
And that brings us to the last team in the NFC West, the Arizona Cardinals. For their greatest strength, once again, I kind of couldn't pick a single player or anything, so I went with a whole group. Their offense. I think they're going to be a really high motor offense. I think the addition of Marvin Harrison Jr. is a great weapon for Kyler Murray. Um, Obviously, he was looking a lot better at the end of last season when he came back from his injury. He was starting to look more solid. James Conner had a career season. He broke 1,000 yards for the first time in his career, and he did it in only 13 games and finished with 5 yards per attempt, which is huge. And then you also have Trey Benson, Greg Dortch, Michael Wilson, and Trey McBride, which I really think they round this offense into one that could be really, really dominant against most defenses.
Yeah, I actually kind of narrowed down the offense a little bit for my biggest strength, but I will get back to what you said. I said the run game, specifically. Drew Petzing, the offensive coordinator there, has a background with the Cleveland Browns, and the Minnesota Vikings. And if you kind of look into kind of where he came from, Minnesota Vikings first, then the Cleveland Browns, and you kind of ask, why did he change teams? He is a Kevin Stefanski disciple. And if you know anything about Kevin Stefanski, that man knows how to put together a run game. And I think that that is what Drew Petzing did very well last year. Obviously, you talked about James Conner hitting 5 yards per carry, which is not unheard of, but it is difficult to meet in today's NFL. Typically 4.2, 4.3 is the average. So five even is actually a very good average. Um, I think that James Conner, obviously, I think he's going into year 30, potentially year 29, for his age. So I think that the drafting of Trey Benson early in the 2024 NFL draft was a huge move by Monty Austin, their general manager. I think that Kyler Murray, despite his injuries, is still a dynamic runner. And so I think with all three of those, Drew Petzing is going to put together a very, very scary run game. Going back to what you were saying about the rest of their offense, I don't disagree with you. I think their team is built to run. I think they've got good weapons. I don't disagree at all, especially Marvin Harrison. I'm sorry. Murray to Marvin Harrison is about to be an incredible, incredible connection. But I think past MHJ, obviously you mentioned, like, I think you said Zach Pascal. They've got Zay Jones. Michael Wilson is a good player. I think I did say at one point they brought in Michael Carter from the New York Jets. Not a bad team. I just think that those receivers, that group, that setup is not, like we talked about Seattle. So I think that they're in a position where they are okay with focusing on the run. Obviously, they drafted Tip Ryman, who is one of the best run blocking tight ends, even just in the league in general as a rookie. I think that they're going to run a whole lot more than they pass. I could see them running 30 to 40 runs or times a game. So, kind of complementing what you said about the offense, specifically that run game is going to be dynamic and strong, and I'm really excited to watch it.
Yeah, for sure. That I it was a pretty simple choice for me then to pick their biggest weakness, defense. Picked offense for strength and defense for weakness. They only had 33 sacks last year, third worst in the league. I think we talked about this in our first episode uh, about the draft. It's just, it's not a great defense. They really suffered. They only had more sacks than Chicago and Carolina. And Gannon, being a defensive minded coach, he's going to want something different. And so I think now they get to start building a defense that he wants with new players, but I think it's going to take some time. And it this defense, as it stands right now, may not be able to keep the offense off the field for very long. So there's a chance that while the offense may be really high power, they get gassed easily and start to suffer during the second half of games.
Yeah, I could totally see that happening. I think I didn't put that as my biggest weakness, but I completely agree. Like that definitely could be an issue going into those games. Obviously, we saw that happen with a lot of teams that run like Jonathan Gannon's. An example of mine from last year would be the Chicago Bears. They struggled a lot with fatigue. It wasn't that their defense as a whole was necessarily the weakest ever, right? Arizona has some playmakers, Bilal Nichols, Dennis Gardeck, even Zaven Collins has been good at times. But as a whole, those players that aren't as good are making an impact on that team. And then, you get into the third and fourth quarter, like you said, the players who are good on that defense start to suffer for it. And that's when the offense says, "Oh, we can't keep up with this. They scored in like 3 seconds. We can't do that. Have fun, trying to catch up your catch your breath on the sideline because it's a shootout now." So I agree completely with your assessment. Yeah, my biggest weakness is the offensive line. I they weren't an incredibly graded offensive line last year. I think at the end of the year they looked a little bit better after Kyler Murray came back, but I won't say that that was them because obviously it's Kyler Murray, so there's, some Kyler magic happening back there. I think that Paris Johnson Jr., I think he was selected like fourth or fifth last year. He was a really early pick. Um, he was a very good tackle last year, and he's going to only get better. But outside of him, there isn't much strength on that line. No matter who was on that line really last year, which was a decent rotation of players, they did suffer and they didn't do much in free agency or the draft to change that this year, which is a concern of mine. So I expect much of the same. Kyler Murray will make it look better for sure, but it could be a rough season in terms of the offensive line.
Yeah, for sure. I agree completely. Their offensive line is not great past PJJ. Uh, but I think Kyler Murray really helps to alleviate some of those woes. Um, I it just makes me think back to that play. I think it was against the Raiders on the 2 point attempt where I think he scrambled something like 108 yards before throwing the ball and getting a scoring the 2 point conversion. But I mean, he's just electric when he's healthy, when he has the space to run around and just play ball his way. Which leads right into the X factor. I picked Kyler Murray. It's kind of a similar situation to what I said for the Rams and the Seahawks with Stafford and Geno. He needs to stay healthy first of all, and then he's got to kind of try to capture some of that magic in a bottle that he's shown flashes of. We've seen it. The Cardinals have made it clear they're committed to him this season. He's their guy. So now he just needs to stay healthy and prove that he deserves the contract that he has, but also the trust that he's being given by the organization.
I agree. Um, See, my biggest thing, and I mean, this kind of plays into your talk about the X factor with Kyler Murray, is obviously if you remember the injury, the ACL injury that actually happened to him, 2022. I remember talking to a couple of friends, and they seemed to have remembered that it was a contact injury. But I was like, no, 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 it was not a contact injury. It was during the Patriots game in 2022. He was scrambling, and he literally moved to one side, moved to the other, and his knee just gave out under him. And, the interesting part about football is That's not like, just going to happen to any player most of the time. Obviously, cleats and turf and freak accidents happen. But a lot of the time, that kind of thing where your knee just fully gives out under you is because of constant strain over and over and over and over and over. And, going back to that offensive line, it's a little bit of a concern with that line being not very strong. If Murray keeps taking hits like he has been, it could happen again. And right now, things I've been hearing out of OTAs and training camp is he's got a, great motion. He can move it. He can, run like he normally can. But how long is that going to last? And in 2, 3 years, is he going to be the same player? So I agree completely. He is a good X factor, for sure, because if he can't be the same dynamic player that he was when he was drafted first overall, it's now 5, 6 years ago. Then it could be a tough season and a tough couple of years cap wise for the Arizona Cardinals. My X factor is a little bit different. Obviously, Murray's a really good one. For me, it's Marvin Harrison Jr. I already spoke a little bit on. I'm a fan of the Arizona Cardinals pass catchers this year, but I'm not gonna sing their praises like I did Seattle or Brandon Ayuk and Debo Samuel. Um, for Marvin Harrison Jr., he is the playmaker on that receiving core. I think that the others are good players, but if Marvin Harrison is good, the Cardinals' pass game will be good. But Marvin Harrison has to come out and play like he's expected to play. And obviously, there's a lot of pressure on him. I've compared him to Larry Fitzgerald. Super happy he did go to Arizona because of that comparison. But obviously, there's always that pitfall with comparing rookies to established veterans like that, future Hall of Famers. Because if Marvin Harrison comes in and doesn't have a season or a career like that, it's going to be really disappointing. Now, I expect he will. I expect a Puka Nakua-esque season from Marvin Harrison, and that's why I name him the X Factor. I think he's going to go out, he's going to dominate. He can get those 50-50 balls. He can run 50 slants a game. He can catch those focused catches that just, really easy catch and, got to turn up field really fast. He is that type of receiver. I don't think he's going to struggle in terms of receiver fundamentals. So as long as he's able to as long as Kyler Murray's able to get the ball to him, I think it's going to be a very good season for MHJ.
I'm going to guess you didn't pick him for your notable rookie then.
Yeah, so I actually picked their other first rounder, Darius Robinson. I remember actually watching the draft that night during the first round, and I remember Darius Robinson went off the board, and everybody expected him to go in the first, right? It was no question. But I remember Arizona taking him, and there were a couple of notable pass rushers still on the board. I don't remember off the top of my head who now, but I remember sitting there and I was just kind of like, "Oh, okay." But I kind of, thought about it a little bit more. I kind of fit him into the whole scheme of, Gannon's defense. And I think that while it wasn't the flashiest pick in the first round, and it definitely wasn't Arizona's flashiest pick, he is a very good pass rusher. And what Arizona needs more than anything right now isn't some guy to come in and, be a flash in the pan or be a great player on first down and eventually become an every down rusher. They need somebody who can impact every single play. And that's what I think Darius Robinson does well. He's not going to get a sack every time. He might not even get a pressure every time, but he is going to be consistently the same player all season, 17 games. And I think that that was actually a very wise pick by Monty Austinfort because Darius Robinson's going to come in and help flesh out that defensive line that was like bottom of the league last year. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like I said, only 33 sacks last season. They need somebody to come in and just help eat somebody up on the offensive line. It doesn't matter if you get the sack. You just got to block somebody else so that someone can get through. And so I think that's a really solid pick overall. Um, I ended up going with running back Trey Benson, who I mentioned briefly earlier. I was really impressed looking at his stats from his last season in college. He had 5.8 yards per carry and 14 touchdowns. And so I think him kind of coming in as a support role for Connor and then maybe taking over if Connor doesn't get extended. I think they're really setting up nicely to continue having a dominant head down running back who can really get lots of yards on every carry, make it every carry count. So yeah, I went with Trey Benson there because, and part of that is also because MHJ was a little bit too, obvious. Duh.
A really interesting part about Trey Benson, for starters, when I watched him, one of the only comparisons that I could, that came to mind that I was like, okay, that fits. I'm gonna put that in my notes. Is James Conner? I feel like this keeps happening. James Conner is very similar to Trey Benson's size, how they play, and that's a really awesome thing. Obviously, James Conner is 29. He turned 29 in May, so happy birthday to him, first of all. But secondly, you said, oh, if James Conner gets extended, given that I don't see James Conner getting extended. As the NFL has been treating running backs recently, it's just one of those things where it's like, hey, you've done a great job, you've been playing well. Unfortunately, I mean, age is a factor. So unless he's willing to come back on a really cheap deal or a really short deal, I just don't see it happening. But Trey Benson is as close to a 1-to-1 trade in as you can get in terms of running backs. He was my number 2 running back in this draft, second to Blake Corum. So I'm a big fan of Trey Benson, and I think that he's a great fit for Arizona and for Drew Petzing and that bruising running offense that he's going to run.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's going to be a really solid 1-2 punch between Connor and Benson, at least for this season. We'll see where that takes them in the future. Alrighty, last up, the biggest games for the Cardinals. What are your thoughts on this?
That is a tough one. I hate to be that guy, but the Arizona Cardinals are a hard team to kind of pick out best games for, because I don't expect them to be, a playoff contending team. Yet I think they will be a good team soon, but yet. So I picked one that kind of caught my eye specifically, and that is Week 15 versus the New England Patriots. That's two teams that have really interesting rosters. The Patriots obviously brought in not necessarily all new coaching staff, but they obviously had coaching turnover. They're bringing in new players. That offense is going to be brand new, completely different. Drake May, obviously. The Arizona Cardinals did very similar things over the last couple of years.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a really good game to put on here. I kind of went with two stretches of games that I think are going to be indicative of how their season's going to go. And that opens up with weeks 1 through 3. They travel to Buffalo and they play the Bills. Then they come back home and they host the Rams and the Lions. Those are three really solid teams. Um, it's early in the season, so we're not really quite sure what to expect from any of the teams involved. I think if the Cardinals do really well early in the season, then that's a good look for them moving forward. And that brings me to the second stretch of games, which is weeks 17 and 18, where they're at the Rams and then host the 49ers. These games, much more irrelevant if the first three go really poorly. If they go 0 and 3 to open the season, it's probably best to just look away for a little bit, hope that they can pull something together mid-season, or just watch them in the draft again next year. But if they go, if they can win even one of those games really solidly and keep the other two close, or win 2, or even 3, I think there's a good chance that they have a shot at the playoffs. And that's when those week 17, 18 games become a lot more important to keep an eye on, with them not just being in conference, but both being in division. Those are really big games if they can pull something together early in the season. That wraps up our NFC West deep dive. Thank you to everybody who's watching. We really appreciate your time and dedication to listening to us talk about football. We just really enjoy doing this. And so if you'd give us a like, maybe comment on something if you have any thoughts, we'd really appreciate that. And yeah, we'll see you guys soon. Thanks for watching.